So next up, we have some more technical stuff or more technical topics today. As we indicated yesterday in terms of our tracks. We're for the rest of the session, we're going to really focus on film reproduction, which has been, from my perspective, a very important part of what TT brings to the table in terms of hardware, software, and brain trust. Digitizing film is actually a really large part of our business. We sell a lot of film scanning solutions, and there's a lot of in-house passion that you'll find out more about of our staff and R&D and so forth that just love scanning film. And a lot of our clients have lots of film to scan as well. So I've asked Arnab and Spencer to co-present because out of the company, both Spencer and Arnab have spent the most amount of time uncovering techniques, solutions, and so forth that have gone from what I've seen and read well beyond what other company has offered with direct capture solutions. So to kind of give you a little bit of background on who's going to present today is Spencer Zidarich. He's our cultural heritage system specialist at DT. He dedicates a lot of his time for providing support training and consulting on all things related to cultural heritage. Spencer himself is a photographic artist. He has a great eye, knows how to make beautiful pictures, and would never settle for anything that was substandard. And you'll see some of that through his illustrations. He has a deep knowledge and focuses on standards compliance and has great interest in the digitization of transmissive materials that I've indicated. Spencer holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Columbia College in Chicago, where he first got involved in the culture heritage community, working as an art handler and preparator at museums around the city, including the Museum of Contemporary Photography and the Block Museum of Art. Over the years, Spencer has continued to hone his experience working as a collections photographer and assisting photographer with the digitization of their film archives. And you're going to see later on today in our keynote, he did quite a bit of work on autochromes and those types of things, which is extremely fascinating. Co-presenting with Spencer is Arnab. Arnab has a formal engineering background in school. And he's the kind of guy that would most normally kind of follow the track of working for Xerox or General Electric and things of that nature. I mean, incredibly smart man. However, Arnab has a huge passion for photography and film, which is just fantastic. So he's going to provide a lot of insight to that. So Arnab, as I said before, is an engineer and a member of the R&D team at Digital Transition, specializing in film digitization and post-processing. Has a personal passion for film photography and a strong digital imaging background. He works to keep film alive in both cultural heritage and the commercial photography sectors. So I'm going to hand over the mic and the camera to Arnab and Spencer, and waiting for their fantastic presentation.
Let's go ahead and pull up the slides here. So thanks for the intro, Pete. Spencer is going to be doing the first half of the presentation. I'll be doing the second half. So I'll actually turn off my camera from now and let Spencer take over, and I'll pop on later. So take it away, bud.
Arnab, I didn't know we were coordinating outfits. I didn't get that memo. Good job. All right. Hey, everybody. So I'm going to basically just dive into some of the work that I've been doing and research that I've done and just things that I've really found that have been very helpful for sorry, there's an alarm going off outside my window right now. For reproducing black and white film, this mentions the negative. There is going to be some reversal film in here, but the concepts do apply still. So one thing I want to look at is the ways in which we can illuminate the film and how we can control things like errant light, ambient light in the digitization setup. I know that Doug mentioned that light flare or errant light in the room can be detrimental to the digitization process and the capture of either reflective originals or even transmissive originals. So lens shades can be tremendously helpful. But in this situation, I'm actually foregoing any sort of lens shades and moving into how we're actually controlling the key light source itself, being our light box. So to start out, I had some 16mm black and white reversal film. This was imaged at 1:1 magnification, which equates to about 6,500 ppi. This was done with a Phase 1 IQ4 150 megapixel camera and Phase 1 120mm macro optics. So 3 different captures of the exact same piece of film show that we actually have very different responses in the raw data, and that's apparent in the exposure evaluation tool in Capture One. Some people may have used this before, some people may have not, but think of it as just a histogram for the raw data. It's completely independent from the RGB histogram. This is basically telling us, is our raw data clipped or not, and how is it distributed throughout the dynamic range. So image on the left, we have no ambient light gating. Image in the center, we had some ambient light gating on only the horizontal edge, being the long edge of the film in this situation. And then on the right, we had the ambient light being gated on the horizontal and vertical edges of the film. Think of this as, we'll see an example over at the next slide, but consider the version 3 update to the film scanning kit that Doug presented on earlier, right? This is all about controlling as much light pouring through the digitization setup as possible. And really, it may be difficult to see through the web broadcast here. In the actual images themselves, they're all equally quite underexposed, at least they seem underexposed. We see that on the left, with no light gating, the exposure evaluation shows that the raw data sort of chops off. It doesn't quite clip, but it does chop off very harshly towards the dark end of the spectrum. In the blacks, when we add a little bit of gating, we see that the black point, or the Dmax, does kind of decrease just a little bit here. And then all the way on the right, the exposure evaluation graph does show that it seems to be clipping, although, and the image is darker, but what we will reveal later is that it's not actually quite the case. And so this is just an example of really what I was doing. This is that 16mm film stock in our ANR carrier. So this is the full glass plate. It's not gated on either side inherently. So first capture, 0 gating, all of the light that could possibly come through the frame. That 9x11 inch frame is kind of pouring up through the camera, bouncing off the walls, and just kind of interfering with the surface of the film emulsion itself. And in the center, there's the ambient light gating on just the one edge, and then finally gating off all of the light so that there is no, as little as possible, right? I'm not going to gate all the way to the edge of the film. It's just not practical to do in mass. But even just a little bit does go a long way. And we can kind of see a little bit through this example that we have a little bit, we have like a sort of a less detail in the image on the right, where there's, we have all of this gating going on. And it seems like maybe we have better detail over on the left-hand side with no ambient light gating at all. But what that actually translates into when we start to open up that file in the software, in Capture One, and stretch that raw data around, shows that we actually have completely destroyed our Dmax by allowing all sorts of light to pass through the film, bounce off the walls, reflect off of the emulsion, and reflect back at the lens. Also, that also means that there's more light interfering with the front element of the lens, creating lens flare, which is going to create lower contrast and therefore affect the Dmax. And so these 3 images all have the same adjustments. And we can see precisely that. I mean, the image that in the exposure evaluation with no light gating appeared to have no clipping in the blacks. It wasn't clipping any data, and we would expect it to have, full, rich detail from highlights to shadows. And that's very apparent that it's not the case, right? We've actually created so much flare on that on the emulsion that we've obliterated any sense of a black point, and the image just kind of looks, just boring. It looks dead. It doesn't have any life to it. We're on the right side, all the way on the right-hand side, and we control our light very carefully. We can see that we have much better black detail throughout the image. We have from the RGB histogram showing that there's a black point and there's subtle midtones and there's a highlight detail, and everything is sort of retaining that grain structure as well. And we can see that here, right? I mentioned that all 3 images are prescribed with the exact same adjustments. You can see I opened it up about 3.5 stops. The reason I could do that is because the dynamic range of the IQ4-150 being 15 stops, that captured on the film is, probably in the ballpark on average of around maybe 8-ish, maybe 9, maybe more if it had, really great processing. But let's say on average, like around 8-ish. That means all of the data captured by the IQ4-150, as long as I am not clipping white point or black point, that's going to be contained in my digital file, right? So I can increase my exposure pretty tremendously. And it shows that the image on the very bottom, which is where I gated both sides, it has this richness to it, right? It has this really nice black point, and in this 100% view, we can really see that, that shadow detail isn't being crushed. We have a black where there should be a black, right, in the shadows and in between some of those blades of grass and behind the statue and things like that. But we still see and can make out, the greenery in the scene, and see that there's actually a difference between some of the more subtle shadow separation here. So, all that to say is, making sure that you start at the very onset with a good capture that has controlled lighting is just tremendously important for what you want to do later on in post when you're either editing an image or inverting the image and then making other sorts of tonal and contrast adjustments. But we also have to consider, outside of lighting, how we are manipulating that image in software. And so it's, one thing that Arnab and I have spent a lot of time on is looking at the ways that various film curves can impact the rendering of an image, and specifically those film curves being, linear scientific or linear response and film standard and things like that. So this is a negative. This is shot on Tri-X 400. This is 2.25 film, and it's shot by me, a little overexposed, but and that means it was pretty, fairly dense, at least in the highlights. And really, a dense negative shouldn't have to mean that when we create that digital file that we're clipping data or we're losing detail because the camera can't handle it. We know for a fact the camera can handle it. We just have to make sure that we render it in software with the correct adjustments so that what the camera sees is truly being represented in that digital file. The exposure settings that I used to capture this piece of film were identical to those that I used to capture the 16mm film. That is just sort of the benefit of working with a high dynamic range digital back and working in this instant capture workflow, where as long as I maintain that I'm not clipping the light box, I basically set the light box to be just shy of an L value of 100, or just shy of 255 in RGB, being that the light box is not clipping, but that's still the brightest part of my image. The rest of the detail being the film base and the content held in the emulsion will be also captured by the digital back, and we can exploit the sensitivity in the high dynamic range in the shadow detail, the darkest parts of the image for the digital file. That translates very well when we invert it digitally. So here we have our inversion in Capture One Cultural Heritage Edition. You can see that my mode I've chosen is a film negative inversion. So this is going to invert the image. It's using the data properly in order to, adjust my highlights and my shadows accordingly. And this was imaged with the linear response curve, or I should say, I've really just added the linear response curve to it. And we have this really nice kind of quality of light to it, right? We have a nice black point. We have, over there in the wall and in the shadows and things like that, there's these sort of subtle midtones, and we have the sort of nice effect of the quality of light, right? Streaming through the buildings, kind of casting this ray of light down onto the rooftop there and kind of dancing and bouncing off the walls. And quite notably, the sky, this was shot on like a bright, sunny summer day this summer, and the sky looks right. It looks even, right? There were no clouds. It has good tonality there. Contrary to if we simply use that linear scientific curve, linear scientific being completely linear from shadows to highlights, linear response having a slight roll off in our highlights, we actually see that the entire, if we try to, let's say, average the exposure to our highlight detail, right? I've normalized the exposure to the highlight detail to save the sky from clipping or blowing out. Everything else in my image is affected, right? The histogram shows between here, before in response, where we have a nice roll off in the highlights, to scientific, the midtones just kind of get crushed and we don't have that same quality of light. The shadows are compromised just because I'm trying to save the highlights. And even still, we see in the sky, there's a bit more graininess there, and there's some modeling or muddling in the highlights where the sky's kind of poking out behind that building. And really, that's because we're not handling, we're not really handling the film as film should be, right? If we take that perfectly linear curve, linear scientific, and we've inverted this negative, and we increase our exposure so that the dark part of the image just gets brighter and brighter and brighter in the inverted part, we're basically making that film grain go so black and so dense that it is completely detailless. And that's not how film is exposed, right? As soon as that film, those silver crystals get exposed, they can only get so dark, and then any other light that's kind of flying around on the film there, it's exposing other parts. And essentially, linear response is just a little bit more analogous to the way that the negative's actually exposed. Here, we're making compromises, thinking that we should be in linear, but we really want this linear response curve. And so, just a small detail here, we have this film grain detail in the highlights, and it's subtle, but it's still visible, right? And here, when we invert it in that linear response curve, it's actually very analogous to the way that the detail looks in the highlights. It's still very subtle, the gradations are smooth, and we still have that feeling of the film grain. However, in linear scientific, right, this is not, it's just really, it doesn't quite look right? It's has all of these kind of gaps in between the film grain where we've accidentally clipped detail because we're trying to make the way that the film sees, film is basically responding to light and make that just kind of tie up with the digital file there. And so because we've clipped data in that linear scientific curve, we have this splotchiness. There's this highlight halation going on behind the wires and around that AC unit, and it's just really not right. And kind of moving on past some of the technical stuff, really, I think the most important thing to think about is not really losing that visual literacy or aesthetic literacy and thinking about, okay, what do I want this image to look like after, we've taken the film, turned it into ones and zeros, and it lives as this digital print on our computer. How do we want to edit that? I always edit against white so that I have some reference of what the non-image might be, right? My paper base. Then I have a reference for my highlights. I have reference for my midtones, and I have reference for my shadows and my black point. And this is all done, you can see here on the right side, with very, very, very minimal editing, just by having a good quality capture, using the correct film curve, and just messing around with some exposure and some midtone and gamma adjustments. And then just to kind of briefly talk about the differences in the quality of light that we can use to illuminate our film, we have either a diffused or collimated light source. Right, a diffused light source would be something like a DT photon, or a light box that has diffusing panel on it. Right, that light is going to be scattered inherently when it's exiting the light box, travels through the film, through the emulsion, hits the grains, illuminates them, and the sensor records that data. Something like a scanner or virtual drum scanner or the like are going to use a very highly collimated light source. That light is going to be directed in a more or less a single direction at the film grain. And what happens there is that light bounces off the film with much more direction. It basically causes much more reflectance. Whoa. Basically, it's reflecting off of that film grain and causing it to illuminate brighter than maybe it should be, and it creates a harsher film grain, makes things look grainier than they should be, and then that's recorded by the sensor. So here's an image that I had taken. One was shot on the left-hand side, recently shot. The other one is an old Imicon scan from college, actually. And so while I was doing this, I decided I'd actually rescan some images from back in the day and just kind of take a look at what I was finding here with the collimated light. Well, one, we have this pretty nasty line there from a piece of dust that was stuck on the sensor in the Imicon, but you can see that the grain is pretty harsh, and we have really hard edges from that collimated light around things like dust and scratches that could, maybe make things a little bit harder to retouch and actually make spotting more of a pain in the butt later on. In that diffuse light, right, that artifact from the scan, that wasn't in my image. It wasn't scratched. It was simply an artifact. But we have just sort of much softer sort of grain. There's that piece of dust there that's pointed to, that kind of almost gets filled in because the light isn't so direct. In another detail, this is sort of in the background underneath the highway, we've got this sky, the sky poking through the background, and the shadows beneath the freeway. This was done with my recent scan with the diffused light. We have very smooth gradations through the highlights. They're delicate, they are even, and the film grain is there, right? We want to see the film grain, right? It's a three-dimensional object. It exists. We don't want to flatten it, but it's not overly pronounced. Same image, again, normalizing the exposure as close as I could, being that the other one, this was scanned straight to TIFF and my diffused image was done as raw. We have that same effect where basically the light and the reflectance from that collimated light is so intense, it's clipping data and creates what looks like very coarse, very harsh grain in the highlights, very pronounced grain in the shadows, again, because it just looks a little bit, it appears more grainy than it is. So for the last slide, we just have one little bit that I thought was pretty interesting. This is from this is 100% crop from the foreground. And really it's less about the lighting itself and more just about the quality of the optics, because it almost makes it just quite the opposite of what I've been talking about, which is where the diffuse light image actually is appearing sharper, right? That drum scan looked sharper, right? It looked a little bit more crunchy and all that stuff. But actually, here we have an example of how, good quality lighting and good quality optics even at the exact same resolution, about 2100 versus 2040, we have better sharpness on the left. We have a foreground that actually looks in focus. And there's just more dimensionality to the pavement and things like that. And I just thought this was sort of fascinating. And I wish I would have had a scan like this when I was in college, because I remember that my professor always told me that I didn't understand the movements and that my foreground was out of focus on my view camera. And, just like looking back at my files and, looking at things in a loop and then looking at them here now, I'm like, well, I wish I would have had these, back then, and really could have said, hey, yeah, the image is sharp. It's just a bad scan. So there we go. And now I think we're going to turn it over to Arnab.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to take it from here real quick. So now we're going to talk a little bit about color negatives, right? So negatives, as you know, whether they're black and white or color, are not inherently informative, right? So if I'm looking at that negative, I'm not seeing what the person that took that photo was seeing, right? So I need to get some visual legibility, is what I like to call it. And so what I'm actually looking to get is the corresponding print, right? The color print that one would get if they took that negative, put it in a dark room, and printed it in a larger. So it's doable in digital methods, but you need some different tools and some different knowledge to kind of get this to work, because it's a little more involved than it is with black and white negatives. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the science here, and I just want to talk first about how cameras see light, how our eyes see light, and how film sees light. So we're going to start off here, ignore the numbers, and just look at the graph on the left, okay? Look at the region in yellow. And would you say, and let me give my little poll here, I had some stuff, okay, film and light, cameras and light. Would you say that that is linear, nonlinear, linear or nonlinear, right? So just throw your vote in there. It's not a trick question. It's just like, camera sensors, when they see light, linear or nonlinear. All right, so most folks are saying linear. And it is, in fact, a line. It is pretty much linear. So if you put in this many photons, you're going to get this much response. And if you put in that many more photons, you'll get the same amount of increase in response up to a point. So on to the next one. What about our eyes? How do our eyes see light? Again, not a trick question. Is this linear or nonlinear? All right, excellent. Very nonlinear. You can see if you put in like 0.2 on the x-axis, you get a bunch of response. And then if you put in another 0.2, you get a little bit less. And then you put in another 0.2 and you get even less until you hit some saturation point. So now, what about film? So I want you to only look at the red regions. And remember, this is not a trick question. Film and light. Is the response linear or nonlinear? Great. So it looks linear, but a lot of people are answering nonlinear. And the reason the people are answering nonlinear is because I lied. This is a trick question. If you look at the bottom there, this is actually a log scale on the x-axis, which means that if something is linear on this chart, it's actually exponential, like the little J curve that you see off to the right. The curve that you see further to the right there is an S curve, and that's what you get when you have a limited amount of silver, as you do in a print. So, or a print or a negative. So film responds non-linearly, and it responds more similar to our eyes. So we need to take this into account when we're working with a digital sensor. Okay. So, oh, and the way that we do this, if you look at the other two slides I had here, is when you're looking at a camera, you can see in the curve that I have here in my base characteristics, I'm working with a linear response. Spencer talked a little bit about that and the differences between linear response and linear scientific. If I want to emulate the human eye curve, that's where the film standard curve comes in. And the reason that that's in Capture One is because you want to take the digital camera raw file, and from there, you want to create a nice curve on it that would replicate what we see, right? So we want the image to look normal to human eyes. So let's talk about some of the rendering considerations that are specific to color negative film, okay? So one, if you're using a DT system or any real modern camera system, you're gonna have a ridiculous amount of dynamic range, which is great. But when you're reproducing a print, right? You know, we're imaging a negative, but we really wanna get the corresponding print. What you'll see is on the left, I actually have a darkroom print that I made from this negative, and I'll show you the negative a little bit later. Whereas on the right, I have a color-corrected version of the inverted image that I brought in linearly. So you can see there's a lot more detail in there, but it looks really washed out, really faded. That's not representative of what the real scene would have looked like, right? So in general, your print is going to have less dynamic range than your negative, which is going to have less dynamic range than your digital file. So what you really want to do in some cases is you want to lose some of that detail to get a more natural looking scene. Now, I say lose, but what we really mean here is hide, because we're working with a raw file. All of our changes are non-destructive. So if I'm adjusting exposure, where all of a sudden I'm clipping my highlights or my shadows, I can always bring that back because we're working in raw, right? So when you're working with a system like this, you can capture it all, and then you can choose to render what you need, right? So if you look at this picture, it's me watching the Square Park, terrible alignment because my friend took it. It's also super out of focus. But what you can see here on the left is kind of something rendered more like a print in terms of dynamic range. But on the right, if I try and pull out all the detail, I get a really HDR looking image, but you can see that there's really nice detail in the clouds there that I could bring out if I want to make a different print or different rendering. So I'm not losing any of that, and we want to have a high dynamic range system, but we need to consider whether we really want to render all the detail that's in there. And so now I'm going to just extend into the Q&A time since we're running behind here, and we'll just answer the questions in the breakout session. Okay. The next thing we need to consider is contrast, right? So if you look at contrast, this is going to get a little technical. I'm going to talk about gamma curves, but the only thing that you really need to know is that gamma is a way of talking about contrast. It's really correlated with contrast. If you have a gamma of less than 1, you get images that look super flat. If you have a gamma of 1, you get a linear image, which compared to our vision is still super flat, right? Because we have film standard and that nonlinear response versus the linear response of our sensor. And if you have a gamma of greater than 1, which our eyes do, it'll be nice and contrasty. And it could be too contrasty, but we'll talk about where we want to go with that for rendering. So film actually has a gamma of less than 1 because it actually has that J-shaped curve, right? So J is below the linear curve. So where does that contrast come from? If the film is very flat, the contrast has to be added back in somewhere, and it's actually in the paper. So when I'm putting my negative in an enlarger and printing it onto paper, the paper has a really high gamma. And if you've ever looked at a contrast curve for any photo in like Photoshop or you know, Capture One, this is a brutal curve. Like if you put that on a digital image, it's going to look awful. But because we're working with a really low contrast image, putting a really harsh contrast curve on it is just going to kind of bring it back to normal, but it is going to compress some of that dynamic range. So just a quick example here. If you look at the negative on the left, that has a low gamma, and this is Portra 400 with a gamma of about 0.2. So remember, gamma below 1 means really, really low contrast. And you see, if I invert it and then normalize the color, it does look pretty washed out, right? So what I need to do is I need to add a contrast curve back in to get it back to where our eyes would have seen the scene, you know, similar to the way that I want to render it. And you'll see here that by adding a contrast curve, and so what I've done here on the back end is I've taken linear response and I moved from linear response to film standard, right? Because we want to see it the way that our eyes would see it. And then I've added an additional contrast curve on there that corresponds to the paper. And if you want more details on that, we can talk about the specifics of it. But essentially, you need to be sure that you're adding a ton of contrast into your digitized negatives, because that's going to be most representative of the print that you would actually get. Color. You guys are not going to like this one. There's no single right answer. Color negatives, okay? If you take one negative and you give it to 2 different labs to develop and scan, you'll get 2 different scans, okay? So this is Portra 400. We got some nice targets here, and we shot it with the DT photons on the atom, took it, sent it to one lab, shot another roll, same lot, same exposure, same camera, everything right after it, and then we got that image. 2 labs, 2 completely different scans. And so please believe me on that. And if you're an analog printmaker, if you've ever been in a color darkroom, you know that if you're using a different enlarger or different filters or different combinations of those filters, 2 printmakers can create 2 beautiful images that are different, but one is not necessarily wrong. So what we really need is we need tools to render it in the way that we want it to be rendered within, a reasonable, expectation of what a print should look like. So there are a lot of variables, but some things that you really want to use to control for. One, work with good profiles. So that is in terms of color profiles for your lighting, but also film curves and presets that we have that are pre-built for the IXG, IXH, IQ3100, IQ3100 trichromatic, and IQ4150. If you're using those cameras, we can absolutely set you up with some of that. If you're looking to do some film negative conversion, use a calibrated monitor. You have to do that. Film is about color casts. Color negative film is about color casts and opposing colors and making colors normalize out. So you really have to have a proper viewing environment. So a good monitor, a nice dark room where the monitor is the brightest light source is really important. And another one that I've actually found is really interesting is use reference materials if you have them. So if your collection has color negative materials, and I actually forgot to ask a question here. I'm going to throw this one up here. So I'm curious. Is more than 5% of your collection, whether you're an institution or professional photographer or hobbyist, is it color negative film? Do you have a significant amount of color negative film? If you have color negative film and you have corresponding prints that were made from that film, use those as a guideline for doing your color correction, doing your contrast corrections, as I did with that photo of the red house earlier. Okay, so your best friends when you're doing color correction are going to be these tools right here. So the color balance tool and the LumaCurve tool are critical because they do 2 different things without interfering with each other. So the color balance tool is going to let you change the hue, lightness, and saturation of colors, specifically as they oppose one another. And you can see in the wheels here, red is opposite green, blue is opposite yellow. So if I move the dial along one of those axes, I'll take out some blue and add some yellow, and that'll act like a filter on there. But the key is it doesn't affect contrast. If you try and do this with levels or with curves, you'll maybe get the result you want, but you'll also run into issues with changing your contrast, all right? And on the flip side, if you want to change your contrast without affecting your color, the LumaCurve is what you want to use for that. So the LumaCurve will change your contrast without changing your color. There are some other things to consider with color. You can get some wonkiness when you're working with overexposed or underexposed film. This is that photo, and that is the negative on the left that I was showing you earlier. Ektar 100 is a really saturated film, and this is a pretty overexposed image. It might look underexposed on the barn itself, but what you're looking at is actually a super saturated green layer, which corresponds to red. So it's a really dense green layer. And if you invert it, you get these like clown colors, right? And what I really want to do is bring that down to match the print, right? So now it looks kind of muddy and not really as nice, and I probably want something in between the two. But I've used my print for reference, and I can easily go between one and the other, and I can go somewhere in the middle if I feel like it, right? And the last thing I'll cover here is grain. So this is actually kind of interesting because for color negative film, grain is not really grain in the same sense that it is silver halide or a fixed silver in a black and white negative, because silver actually gets removed in the processing. So what are we actually looking at? This is a color positive image, but it's the same because you're working not with silver, but with dye clouds. Okay, so what you're actually seeing here is something similar to almost like pointillism, where you've got like all these beautiful little color dye clouds from the different layers coming together and giving you that overall tone. So if you're working at a really, really high resolution, you might see these. If you're working at a lower resolution, you might not, and that's fine. But be wary of noise reduction, okay? Computers are dumb. They do exactly what we tell them to do. So they can't tell the difference between noise and grain because we tell them, well, if there's differences in contrast and differences in color in a really small area, that's probably digital noise. In the case of a really well-exposed, low ISO, good camera capturing film, that's not the case. What you're actually seeing is actually in the film. So my only couple of recommendations here are to pay attention, especially to your color noise reduction. If you see here, I have 0 noise reduction. And if I add noise reduction and specifically color noise reduction, all that color in the little specks goes away. So before, after, before, after. It's very subtle, but it's something to consider. There's no right or wrong answer on this, but just be mindful that this is something that does happen when you have these like default settings for noise correction. So just know that if you're publishing it at really high res and you want to show that aspect of the film, keep that noise reduction off. If you think it's distracting, keep it on, but pay attention to things like that. So takeaways here, my last minute, are you want to capture the cleanest, broadest, and most precise data set you can, right? I say data set because that's what your sensor is capturing, a linear data set. And so the best camera you have, the reason we use the systems that we do is because that enables us to get the cleanest, highest dynamic range, and best bit depth. Because when you start to stretch and compress these files, that's where the 16-bit nature of our raw files really shine through. In a lot of cases, it can be better to limit what you show rather than showing everything, especially dynamic range-wise. When you're doing color corrections, think like a darkroom printer. So think about opposing colors, filters, moving from blues to yellows, from reds to greens, and correcting biases that way. And don't be a perfectionist. Don't get hung up on the idea that, this isn't the right answer. There's no right or wrong answer. Well, okay, I take it back. There's no single right answer. There are several wrong answers. But, don't get hung up on that. It's not perfect, okay?